Welcome back to another episode of the Seafarer Social Podcast. Today I'm speaking to a very big figure when it comes to the maritime world on LinkedIn, specifically Steven Jones. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. He's a big name, especially here in the UK, when it comes to the maritime world. He's worked on numerous different projects across the whole of maritime, but one particular project that I'm interested in speaking to him about today is the Seafarer Happiness Index. Steven is the founder of the Seafarer Happiness Index, and that has become one of the most popular resources across all of maritime that people refer to every quarter to see how seafarers are, how they feel, how they act, and their overall opinion on the industry, which I think is such an important resource. But firstly, before we get into that, thank you very much, Steven, for accepting the invite. And how are you?
Thanks, Carl. It's good to be here. Thanks for the kind words. A big name on LinkedIn. I don't know. That's the beauty of it. We could all become big names on LinkedIn. It's only our own energy that stops us from doing things. So, it's great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. I know you're doing great things, speaking to seafarers, engaging with the younger generation as well. So hopefully, we can cover all those aspects as well. So thanks for the opportunity.
That's absolutely my pleasure. I remember when I first started working in maritime, my previous employer said to me, there are two people that you need to get on your side if you want to push the LinkedIn thing, and that's Gordon Foote and Steven Jones. They're the two figures on LinkedIn, and if you can get them on your side, you get a lot more eyeballs on what you have to say. So yeah, thank you so much for supporting me. I've only been around for just over a year now, and you've always been a big supporter since the start, so I really appreciate it. But talking about the start, let's talk about your start. So what inspired you to start a career in maritime?
I think it was inevitable. The child of a seafarer, and probably going back, I mean, I had to stop on Ancestry.com because I was spending too much time on that. But many generations of seafarers in my family. I actually went to sea when I was 7 for the first time on my father's ship, sailing from Liverpool over to the Caribbean. So it was almost inevitable. GCSE results almost made it wasn't inevitable. But apart from that, once I managed to steady myself a little bit, then it was off to sea and kind of never looking back.
So how have you seen seafaring change since you were a child to now, specifically in the UK?
I mean, it's a really interesting point, and I think I'm very fortunate in many ways that because I had that opportunity to go on to ships so long ago and see what the kind of, if you like, the old ways of doing things were. So it was a container ship, but it was still manned in very much almost a kind of old-fashioned general cargo ship way. There was a lot of people, so it was kind of really fascinating to understand the kind of the dynamics. And then also, as I started my own career at sea, started off on bulk carriers with very small crews, and then ended up going on to work on cable ships again with more people because there was a lot more manual handling of things going on. And I think that has been the change, the number of people, the opportunities to interact, the social life, and the glue that either hangs people together at sea or doesn't is really what makes the big change in how life, the reality as it unfolds before someone walking up that gangway, and what they're faced with is people. Whether there's a lot of them, whether there's not many, whether they're friendly, whether they're not, whether they're tired, whether they've got the scope to engage. That is the big difference in all matters, really.
And you're based in Liverpool, am I right? So you've got Liverpool Port on your doorstep. This is one of the biggest ports in the UK, and still extremely active today. Are you still seeing seafarers darting around Liverpool?
Yeah, we do. You can always spot the big bags of Toblerone and a new pair of Nikes. So yeah, they're out there. We even have a Jollibee in Liverpool now. So wow. I think that's, so if you want to find the seafarers, that's where they are. Yeah, it's a busy port, but historically, seafarers was such a vital, vibrant, visible part of it, and that isn't the case anymore. I know to spot a seafarer because we know how to spot seafarers. But in the main, there is a disconnect between the reality of society today in port cities all around the world and the people who were so busy actually making it all happening, generating the wealth, keeping the trade flowing, doing all the vital things. So there's a definite disconnect between shore and the ship now, and that's a slightly troubling reality.
What do you think that's created that division?
I think the evolution of the industry, the natural flow outward, ports have got bigger, they've moved out of city centres. The kind of the evolution of any port has always been bigger, bolder, and out. So we're separated now. The fact is that we just don't have that flow and relationship with ships that we used to have. It was very interesting just a couple of weeks back in Liverpool, the Queen Anne, the new Cunard vessel, came
Yeah.
in. And there is still an incredible interest in certain ships, in the notion of the river bringing everything that it does. But you almost have to make people look that way and see it, because otherwise every vessel that comes in is pretty much invisible, and it lacks that kind of link to everyone. People are just kind of going about their daily lives, and they don't necessarily see, feel, or even think about the ships that are doing the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting because obviously I'm based in Portsmouth,
Right.
and we have obviously an extremely big connection to the sea, primarily from a naval perspective. But
Yeah.
I remember being as a kid actually, if there was a big ship coming in, everybody would make their way to the viewing point, and we'd all watch and we'd wave it by, and that appears to have actually died down as years have gone. The last time people got super excited was obviously when the Virgin Voyage came through, and that was a big
Right.
one, but that was primarily around fantastic marketing. You don't really get that same buzz anymore, which I think is a real shame.
Fantastic marketing works, and maybe that's what we're lacking in all of this. There just isn't that relationship between the reality of people's lives and the value of the ships, and of course the seafarers inherent in that. And we just do not have that relationship anymore. Occasionally, as you say, you'll get everyone rushing down to the riverside to look. Prince of Wales, the aircraft carrier, that was one that got everyone interested. I'd say the Queen Anne, the Sir David Attenborough, obviously built just along the river here at Camberlades, was one that managed to capture the imagination. But we do not capture the imagination in our day-to-day. The tankers, the bulk carriers, the container ships that come in just doesn't do that, sadly.
And these are the vessels that are making our economy function. Without them,
Totally.
there'd be no Christmas. There'd be no Sainsbury shelves stacked with food. It's just and I think you're totally right. One of the things that I'm very passionate about, um, from an advertising background, because my background's in advertising, is actually the opportunity of being able to bridge that gap between the wider public and the understanding of the value behind seafarers and the job they do.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anyone's ever been able to really do it, and I actually think there's a really big story to be told there.
Totally. I mean, for the Day of the Seafarer last week, I was deliberately provocative, trying to write an article for Splash 24/7, and I tried to realistically crunch some numbers to get an idea, a sense of the value of a seafarer. We know how many there are, 1.9 million, give or take, which is an incredibly small population. It's akin to a very small city, but carry the weight of everything. And if you look, even the conservative estimates of how much money, the value of shipping to the global economy and what we do, you equate to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of actual tangible financial value that an individual seafarer could be equated to. And I think, again, we need to capture the value. We're always talking about the cost of everything, and things do come with a cost. But unless we balance the equation by talking about the value as well, then we just totally missing the point and the ability to talk openly, proudly, and to get the message through about how important shipping is.
Yeah, I totally agree. Maybe that's something else you could focus on in terms of maybe a value per seafarer index. That would be
Yeah,
quite an
yeah.
interesting study to create.
I think it'd be quite frightening to see just how valuable each individual seafarer is, because of course then, with value becomes a need to actually reflect that and what you do and how we. So yeah,
Big alarm bells for the shipping companies there.
totally.
I remember last year at the London Shipping Week, there was one event across the whole week that focused on the seafarers, and it was hosted in the Fishmongers Hall, and it was all of the charities that came together, and they discussing the landscape of seafaring, etc. I remember one really powerful moment where one of the CEOs of the charities, and it was an audience of ship management, ship owners, etc. And one of the CEOs said, "How many people in this room would recommend a career of seafaring to their child? Please put your hand up." And as you can imagine, no hands went up. And I just thought, Jesus Christ, this says it all. What do you think on that point, as to why people that run these ships, manage these ships, and they have this labor market that are the heart and beating of their business, they would not recommend that kind of profession for their own child?
Yeah, I mean it's a question that does often get asked, and of course the answers are usually the same. And I think really it needs to be a different framing of the question. It isn't so much, would you send your children to sea now as it is? It's more a case of how can we make seafaring worthy of your children? And
Yeah,
that's not just a business executive sat in London, all doing the wonderful things they do. It's about, what is seafaring? How can it be made better? I think this is also one of the debates that we're talking about in diversity. Encouraging female seafarers is a vital and hugely important part of what we do. But we have to also make it worthy. It's no good just trying to go and grab a load of new people and put them into seafaring if the role, the respect, the rewards, the actual reality is not worthy of those people. I think we need to balance again, balancing the equations always. How do we make seafaring worthy of them? Make it an enjoyable, proud, wonderful profession as it should be and as it needs to be. And I think that's really, the question that we should be asking. Not would you send them to sea, but how can we make it worthy of you wanting to send them to sea?
so let me spin the question to you: how can we make seafaring attractive to the next generation?
I think we have to have a really honest, difficult debate about where it is. I think one of the problems for the industry is that when we go to the likes of that event, and I was there as well, it's the good that's always there in the room. It's the good companies. It's those that do invest, that do, care, that do try to do good things. They don't always get it right. Even the very best in the industry don't always get it right, but they're trying. And so it's kind of quite an unfair discussion, because they can quite rightly hold their hands up and say, well, we're doing everything we can. We have, good food. We support them. We've got gyms. We've got the things that people want on the ships. But the minute you scratch below that surface, the second you go beyond the very best, you're getting into a very dodgy part as well, where things really aren't as they should be. And that's really where we need to start. We need to start being able to drag ourselves into the darker corners of the industry and start looking at the realities as they are experienced by seafarers. And unfortunately, the good companies can't do that because they're doing the things that they can do. So we need to find the mechanisms to get a bit more realistic. And that's always been the aim of the Seafarers Happiness Index. And that's why it's so important working with the Mission to Seafarers, because it opens up that population, that community of seafarers who perhaps wouldn't ordinarily be heard or have their message translated in a way to the industry that we can move these things forward, that we are tired, that we are frustrated, that the food's awful, that we don't get shore leave, that the ports aren't doing the things that they should do to support us. We can all of a sudden bring the real narrative of the experiences of the vast majority of seafarers to the fore. And
Yeah,
that's how we drive change.
yeah, I totally agree. And I want to talk more about the index shortly, but before we do, I want to talk about our country, the UK. How
Yep.
how we as a country can begin to educate the next generation on the opportunities for careers in maritime. And let me explain. I recently spoke to a cadet guy called George who studies at Warsash, just down the road from me. And he was explaining to me that when he was at school, he never ever was informed by any careers advisor whatsoever about the concept of joining the merchant navy. Yes, there was numerous talks about joining the Royal Navy, and for some they don't even know the difference.
Yeah, totally.
He actually went on to tell me that when he would tell his friends that um, he was thinking about a career in the merchant navy, they thought he was going to be going to war and things like that. They had absolutely
Yeah.
no idea whatsoever on the opportunities that maritime brings from that perspective. So, what do you think we can do from our country, the UK, to actually educate the world, the next generation on the career options in maritime? Because it's not just in the merchant navy. There's tons of opportunities out there.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult and it is a problem. There are initiatives out there. The UK is very good at creating organisations to help promote change. Actually, driving the change usually ends up being slightly harder than that. But there's no
Yeah,
end of initiatives, people going into schools, all the rest of it. But, one person stood in front of 20 children isn't the strategic approach to getting this done. I think we need to be better at tying in again the ships into local communities, and I guess that's where you start. So instead of the top down, how does a nation start to get people interested in going to sea and getting them back onto ships? You build up from the local perspective, making sure that people do understand what that ship going past their city, their town, their school actually is. There's a really good initiative in Greece which is building relationships between schools and vessels and particular seafarers on them. And I believe that they're having some quite good success on building that relationship between what ships do, who the seafarers are, and lo and behold, the kind of alchemy within that of like, oh, maybe I could go to sea. Maybe I'd like to do that. So I think very much the kind of the local re-establishing of links between the sea, between ships, between seafarers is pivotal in this.
yeah, sure. I totally agree. And there's a lot more that can be done in creating those links,
Yeah,
as we discussed. When you speak to seafarers, a large buzzword that we keep hearing in the corporate world specifically, it's slowly starting to spread out to the seafarers, is this autonomous shipping.
yeah,
Am I going to lose my job? Um,
yeah.
is there a day where eventually I'm no longer needed? What's your opinion on autonomous shipping and how this will affect crew?
I think it's a real issue to people and a concern. I'm part of the Nautical Institute up here in Liverpool, and our branch often engages with Fleetwood College, and we have cadets come to attend, and they do a fantastic job, and they really, they make you proud to be in the industry. But what doesn't make you proud is when they look you in the eye and say, will I have a job in 10 years' time? What is the point of me pursuing this and putting everything I've got into this? Where will I be? And the honest answer that you have to say is, you don't really know. But if we're all in it and we're all committed to positive change, then we must be able to shape something positive. I think the danger of autonomy is that it's been driven, the agenda has been set, the narrative, all the talk has come from very much the technical possibility perspective rather than any thought of, well, where does that actually mesh with what we have? So all of a sudden, everything is about the art of the possible and not so much the art of the slower probable. So we have been left with a bit of a gap of, well, what does it mean? What will happen to my job? Where is my future? And I saw an article the other day about a company in Norway that have been granted dispensation to start to take chief engineers off the ship and have the chief engineers sat ashore. Well, that's a really worrying kind of death by a thousand cuts, because it's not only are you scared of the ship, becoming autonomous and what that means. You're scared of the fact that you're going to be the last one left on the ship and what that means as well. So it's almost a kind of, where are we left in all of this? The answers aren't clear. The technology seemingly has huge potential, and we must always be open to technological change and embrace it. But if we don't control the reality as it's perceived by people that are impacted, then you can't have, and this comes back to also issues of sustainability, etc., the just transition, the involving everyone in that journey towards where we want to get. If you don't do that, then it just becomes a transition and you're just moving. And if you're moving too far, too fast away from people who care, then you're creating problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it is very alarming, the concept of bringing, especially when we're talking about chief engineers and officers off the ship onto shore. But one thing I think is really interesting is that whenever people talk about autonomous shipping, the conversation is always around navigation. And the big thing for me, and I spoke to Captain James Foong about this, is that before we even talk about navigation, we need to crack safety, right? I mean, and how on earth are we going to create autonomous safety? If you have a bulk carrier, big fire sets out, what are you going to do? Are you going to have some sort of robots that are going to take this fire? So I think before the conversation around navigation goes any further, there needs to be some sort of solution for autonomous safety.
Yeah, and because the debate has been led by technology companies, that has been the whole angle, and the focus has been exactly on what we can achieve, rather than the rather mundane, boring, and problematic thing of the problems. Because the world of technology doesn't like problems because it thinks it can solve them. So when you do get exactly where you're coming from, the difficult, hard to fix, perhaps even impossible, then where does that leave us? Then it's not a popular viewpoint to have, so it does mean it's more difficult. I was writing an article the other day, and I was pondering this exact issue of autonomy, and I'd pulled out some old letters, and it was a letter to my great grandfather promoting him to chief engineer, and it was nicely in 1924, so 100 years ago. And the letter from the office said, "Congratulations, you've done a great job. We're promoting you. Just 3 things we ask of you: sail at an economic speed, don't work the crew too hard, and send us a message when you get to the next port." So that is autonomy, but just by another form. So we had autonomous ships, but it was the people, the skills, the knowledge, the willingness and ability to do it that was the technology, if you like, in that loop.
Yeah. And I'm personally a believer that shouldn't change. But hey, let's see which direction the world goes in. Let's talk about the Seafarers Happiness Index. I think for me, this is, like I said, one of the most important resources out there currently when it comes to human capital management. Can you tell us a little bit about the initial motivations of why you developed SHI? And tell us a little bit about the context of how it all started in 2015.
Yeah, very much. It was actually working alongside a company who'd established a social media platform, kind of pre-Facebook, really, ahead of their time. So this was a social platform called Crew2. So working with Sue Henney, who had actually established this social network, and in discussing where that was going, what it needed to do, how it could do it, it was a constant case of, well, we're just not getting the voice of seafarers into the debate. So the social interactions between crews were good, were interesting, were useful, and they were doing what they were doing. But there was no way of really harnessing that to do something useful and positive with it. We got looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, kind of looking from a kind of philosophical, psychological perspective on what humans need, want, like, have to function. And we got thinking, well, where do you go with seafarers? What is the seafarers' hierarchy of needs? And then that kind of progressed into, how do you find out if seafarers are happy? And that's a fundamental in life. The fundamental of any relationship is, if you ask, are you happy? You often don't get the answer that you want, but it's important to have that building block. So that's really where it was. happiness as being a fundamental, and then having those kind of building blocks within that of, well, what are the kind of the hierarchy of seafarer needs? So, issues like shore leave, connectivity, links to family, food, fitness, welfare ashore, wages, training, interactions, etc., were felt to be the kind of sensible building blocks of that. And then putting that together, ask the question, get the answers, and then try to kind of weave it into something useful.
Nice. And what are some of the most significant findings that you found over the years since its inception?
Gosh, it's been really fascinating to kind of see that, and almost being a bit of a canary in the coal mine, if you like, being able to see problems at their kind of earliest inception, getting one or two mentions from seafarers, and you kind of, basically the way it's kind of delivered, all the raw data comes through, and I go and get a coffee and sit down and kind of just start scrolling through just to kind of try and absorb what the sense is. And there's a couple of things that will always, every quarter, kind of pop out and you go, that's interesting. You kind of scribble that down. And then, sometimes no one else mentions it, but then all of a sudden, it does tend to be that these trends really weirdly translate across quarters constantly. So what pops up as one or two kind of diverse comments all of a sudden definitely becomes a trend. The things that I guess we've had that probably haven't necessarily been readily discussed elsewhere, or have maybe not bubbled to the surface, issues such as the standard of accommodation, the fact that ships have become such sterile, boring environments that just there's no investment in that. And I was very pleased that the Royal Institute of Naval Architects actually did an article recently on that we spoke about that issue, and inspiring young naval architects to think about the human within that and what we kind of do with it. So that was really a big important turning point. I think issues such as the spend on food is a constant, and it's a depressing one, that you constantly see how low the barriers of acceptance are pushed in the spend on the feeding rate, because that's such an important part of living. Nice food, a good environment, all of a sudden the social kind of dynamic gets flipped and switched, and everyone engages more. The most depressing, I think, has been the issue of drinking water, being left to go thirsty in their day-to-day existence.
You're kidding me.
Just blew my mind. As far as I've been able to ascertain through it, and it's a problem that had been getting increasingly mentioned, I think lots of water tanks have probably not been maintained the way that they should. They probably didn't have the inspections, the physical inspections through COVID. So all of a sudden, the things were maybe allowed to slide. All of a sudden, the tanks have been found that it's not really up to the standard needed for potable water. You can't necessarily drink from it. There's all of a sudden been a panic. Oh, well, we'll have bottled water. But then the pushback against single-use plastics has meant that some ship owners, often working in offices in isolation and not really knowing what the left and right hand are doing. So someone's had the bright idea, and understandable, because single-use plastics are bad. Well, we don't want the bottled water, but we can't use the tanks. So all of a sudden, you've found a situation where there's not enough water to drink for seafarers on some ships, which just blows my mind. And in the 21st century, to be thinking about these things it's utterly depressing. It seems ludicrous. And, and if we can't even get water right, then it does beg the question, how are we ever going to get anything right? And I think, going back to that autonomous question, and of how computers and sensors and all those wonderful things will control ships, what those kinds of technology are very good at is they have operational parameters. And if it isn't the right temperature, if it isn't the right voltage, if it isn't the right everything, then it'll just stop. But seafarers, unfortunately, are more resilient than that. Yeah. We've carried on. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, if you're going to have autonomous ships, and if you're going to have these mechanisms for doing that, then every operational parameter has to be 100% correct 100% of the time. And that is not a lesson that translates from the way that we've treated seafarers, unfortunately.
I totally agree. And I had no idea that that was a big issue. It's
Yeah,
almost difficult to believe.
it is. I mean, when I first started to see it mentioned, I just thought of, one or two terrible ships, the types of owners that are more than happy to abandon a ship, etc. And all of a sudden, it just seemed to be more seafarers were mentioning it. And okay, it might not always be a case that there's no water or they're dying. The fact of just not being able to freely access drinking water when you want it. Look at me, I've been slurping on this, in 20 minutes because you need it. It's important. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I totally agree. You would think that in the 21st century, when a workforce is working for a company that's earning hundreds of millions of dollars, that having the access to water without having to think twice would be just common sense. But
again, the problem in all of this is that if we, on the platforms that we have, so whether it was on LinkedIn or we're stood up at a conference or something, and you say these things, quite rightly, the vast majority, every single person who works for a ship owner in those rooms or on those platforms looks at you like you're an idiot because, well, that doesn't happen on my ships. It couldn't happen on my ships, so it doesn't happen. And that's an understandable response because it's so far removed from what I was saying before, those kind of the upper echelons within the industry. But the minute you go down the ladder, everything changes. Everything changes. And even the most basic of human kind of, expectations, let alone rights, gets trampled on.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You're right. I think the gap is so wide, so wide. And I think, like you said, they would think you're ridiculous because the concept of it is just so unfathomable in their brains. They can't even think for a second that would be the case for them. But frankly, it is.
And there's a lot of, I've had lots of instances talking to incredibly impressive, great people who work for these fantastic, biggest companies that we could all name. And you talk about some of the issues like abandonment. I spoke to someone and I mentioned the issue that, we're looking at abandonment. And they were like, what's that? And you think, well, you explain it. And they're like, no, that couldn't happen. That doesn't happen. And you think, wow, there's such a knowledge disconnect between the good in the industry, and it's nice and it's good, and how fortunate to go through life being ignorant of the bad things, and that's great that the good companies can be immune to that. But until we start to level that playing field, and unfortunately all the regulations and conventions in the world are failing in that regard because there are some terrible people that do awful things, and that's the reality of shipping. Always has been. And, we worryingly suspect that it always might, unless we can somehow disrupt that reality.
For sure. Totally agree. Have you had big shipping companies that have used the index as a resource to be able to create some sort of tangible changes and improvements within the operations?
Yeah, we've been really fortunate that there's quite a few companies who've actually asked to have their own bespoke index performed alongside and then benchmarked against the kind of wider population, and it's really heartening to see that, and the results usually translate into some good wins for them. There's opportunities to learn, all the rest of it. And again, it's been interesting that sometimes it's the small wins that seem to translate really well. There was one company, and weirdly, in so many responses from their seafarers, the issue of coffee machines kept getting mentioned. Now, I don't know what they were, maybe they didn't like the Nescafe Gold blend they were given, but it was constantly talk of this coffee machine. So as we're pulling the report together and delivering it, and it was almost like the end bit, it was like, did they not have coffee or something? Because there's a constant desire to have coffee machines. And they were like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it. And then they obviously went away, did whatever they did, put the Nespresso machines on, whatever. The enthusiasm, the happiness, the response from the seafarers who all of a sudden had got these new coffee machines was fantastic. So all of a sudden, so much of the negativity was just wiped away by one small gesture of listening, responding, and actually fixing something. So it's, just a little illustration of the small steps that can make such a huge difference to people's lives, because they feel listened to, they feel respected, they feel part of it. And there you go. There's a little bit reward as well. Go and have a coffee.
For sure. And the small steps, but also extremely affordable, because, my
Yeah,
experience of speaking to the shipping companies is 99.9% of the time they're only interested if it's to do with profit or policy. But if you
yeah.
if you're really going to buy a £200 espresso machine, which is going to keep your crew of 20 happy,
Yep,
what's the ROI like on that? Very high. I just think
exactly.
it, actually a lot of what we're talking about is it doesn't even cost much money. Like
Nope.
it's such an easy step forward that creates such a large difference.
And I'd
Um,
even go further than that, that caring costs nothing.
yeah, exactly. No, I totally agree. I totally agree. I totally agree. So, one of the big things I always talk about is social media, and
Yep.
I'm curious to know from your side, how do you think social media usage among seafarers impacts their overall happiness and mental well-being?
It's a really difficult question, and I I think in many ways I'm completely torn myself inside. I know the realities of social media and the dangers of kind of the doom scrolling, or the perceptions of other people's lives as being perfect, and why isn't mine, can get in people's heads and all the rest of it. And I imagine that's only kind of amplified when you're away from home and all the rest of it. I think fundamentally the ability for seafarers to feel connected to the world outside is absolutely vitally important, and has to be part of it. I think the mechanism by where we can have seafarers proud of what they do, sharing their stories, showcasing the amazing things that they see, and maybe going back to the point we discussed earlier about, well, how do you get young people interested in the sea? Well, you show them the good things. You show them the fact of you seeing schools of whales going past and the most amazing sunsets, and look at the stars in the night sky, and look at us pulling into this place, or seeing the things that you will not ever see in your life if you only ever remain attached to the shore. The professionalism, the skills that people have, proud of being able to navigate, proud of being able to make machinery work, and all these amazing things, the skills that seafarers have. There's massive benefits that can come, but we need to never be kind of, dismissive of the potential problems as well within that. And it's a balancing act, I guess.
But it's the case with all industries, right? Every single
Yeah,
industry has its risks and benefits. But I'm a big believer that we talked about water, right? And water is a human right for everyone to have access to. But I believe access to digital media, social media, is an ethical right, because every single person has access to it nowadays. And
yep.
why should you miss out just based on your profession?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the it's not so much that anyone should miss out. They shouldn't. I totally believe in 100% connectivity, and that's the way it should be. That's where the future is. That's where the benefits of all of this should be. I think it's just we need to be alive to any of the risks that come with that. The difference of this over other industries is it's the home you work in, or it's the work you live in. It's that is the constant dynamic of that. So we just need to be mindful and make sure that it is delivering all the benefits, and there aren't storing up these problems through connectivity. And that comes down to the social cohesion on board. It comes down to people caring. It comes down to being part of a community. It comes down to feeling happy. Happy people seem to be able to interact better on social media than unhappy. And I guess that's so if we're able to boost the happiness, to make people feel that they are doing something that they enjoy with people in a good environment, then all the benefits that come with connectivity are there. If you don't, if you're tired, if you're fed up, if you're scared, if you're hungry, if you're thirsty, you know, there's can be a negative effect that comes from connectivity.
I understand that, and I think one of the big issues we've got in the industry is that 99.9% of the time, whenever there's a big story that's covered in maritime period, it's always pretty much negative.
Yep,
Um,
totally.
but there are some fantastic case studies for when digital media has been brilliant for the seafarer and for the business. And I'll give you one
Yep.
now. Obviously last month was Pride Month, and a few years ago, Maersk did a campaign where they had a rainbow container ship. I don't know if you saw this. The
Yep.
Rainbow Container World Tour is what they called it.
Yep.
And this, is a beautiful looking container, and it was brilliant for branding purposes. But every single ship this container went on, the seafarers would be filming it. They'd be taking selfies of it. They were writing messages inside. So it's a fantastic branding for
Yep.
the company. It makes the seafarers feel special because something cool and different's happening on board, and they're able to connect to the wider world, and have some appreciation for and a moment of notice for
Yep.
the occupation. So I think you're totally right. I think there are risks, but I think there are risks in every industry. I just think that there's a lot more that can be done on a smaller scale. It doesn't always have to be big campaigns that Maersk can afford.
Yep.
On a smaller scale that every company can do to be able to benefit seafarers' digital content online. And another thing I'll add to that as well is it's the only way, I think, the only way to really connect to the next generation. If you
Yep.
really
Totally.
want to inspire Gen Z, and you really want to, fight against recruitment, retention crises, and things like that, you have to be taking on board a social media strategy.
Yep. Totally. Totally. And we need to prepare seafarers. We need to, to make this part of their onboarding. The cadet training, there's a lot to take in, and if we're not really engaging with this as a part of the industry and what we do and the natural mechanism, then all of a sudden people do make mistakes or misunderstand it or don't make the most of it. So I think again, it's all about preparation and what the expectations are and preparing. I totally agree. Connectivity, the sharing, the positives that come through it. There was a company I saw the other day that had some photos that their seafarers had taken, and they were stunning. And what that told you was not just that the world out there is beautiful and go to sea, but our ships are great as well, and people care, and they've got a bit of time to actually enjoy it rather than the relentless, fatigue-inducing grind of being on a ship with not enough people to do things. So, yeah, we can send out hugely positive messages, and we have to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just think the difficulty is when when I'm working in the professional manner, and I'm posting something for a client or whatever, it's quite normal that because I am working, I'm in my professional zone. I
Yep.
send that asset to be approved before it goes out.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty is with seafaring, but so in comparison to my normal life, I'm not going to ask somebody if I can post a picture of a selfie of myself on my Instagram with my partner, for example. But I
Yep.
think the issue for seafaring is because so much of their life, their normal life, is work.
Yep.
It's difficult for them to be able to post on a personal perspective while also being considerate of their professionalism at the same time. You know,
Totally.
I'm about to take a selfie of this beautiful sunset. I've been on this ship for the last 2.5 months. Is it really? This is my life. Is it really necessary for me to send it to the ship management before I
Yeah,
post
yeah,
it?
yeah.
Maybe it is. I don't know. It's a difficult one. You know what I mean?
No, totally. And the stuff I post on LinkedIn is the difference of the stuff I post on Facebook. And that's the way it
Yeah,
is. That's
yeah,
the reality. And I guess and that comes back down again to this fundamental of a place. Work that you live in, or is a difficult thing to manage because you're in it 24/7, potentially for months, and it's a really difficult balancing act. Who are you as a seafarer? Are you yourself? And at what point are you that person? And at what point are you the third mate, the chief engineer? Where are those lines? And I guess that's the fuzzy bit that people have to be able to work out confidently.
yeah. And it's difficult because there are some blends, but I think there's still something there that can be done, and hopefully I'd like to be part of something like that because I think it's really powerful what social media can do when it's done
Yep.
correctly. Final question for you, Stephen. What piece of advice would you give to the maritime organisations, to the maritime shipping companies, to the ship managers, in a macro perspective, how we can improve the welfare and happiness of our crew?
caring, responding is the kind of, they're the three watchwords of all of that. Because, if you listen to what is being said, that's one thing, but you have to care about it. And if you listen and you care, then you have to respond to it as well. And, go back to the little coffee machines as a point of difference that showed what can happen. So it's about that. It's about the respect that the industry has for seafarers. One of the worrying kind of, divides that's growing is that increasingly there are fewer people in offices ashore that have been to sea. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to expect the same levels of knowledge and empathy about why things have happened on a ship to be translated. So we can't change that. That's the reality of the dynamic that we have. A lot of people ashore now haven't been to sea. Okay. But what do we do with that fact? How do we change that? Spending more time at sea, twinning people with, seafarers to allow them to develop relationships, to understand things better. So I think, the listening, the care and responding is one part of that, but you need to wrap that in a bigger bubble of the empathy and understanding and knowledge that you need to even be able to be at the point of listening, caring and responding.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think there's a world where shipping companies could maybe encourage shore-based workers to come on board for particular journeys to just experience a few weeks away at sea? Something like that could be really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, every company that I've seen that does that, and every person that I've spoken to or seen or read posts or whatever that's done that has benefited enormously. They've not only enjoyed it, they've been fascinated by it. Their work has obviously been changed, and I would suspect for the better, by that experience. So all of a sudden, yes, that investment by any ship owner, manager, operator, whatever, to think about the development of their individuals in the office, so exposing them to time at sea, or even just a visit, just starting to get that ball rolling, to get them to feel what the ship look, feels, smells, the reality is hugely beneficial. And that's the foundation level really of how you develop your people in the office to understand your ship. And if they understand the ship, the seafarers, everything that goes on better, then you have a better company, because the bonds between those that are out at sea doing and those that are ashore managing the doing can mesh properly. At the moment, someone who hasn't been to sea trying to deal with someone who is at sea, the gears don't always kind of mesh.
Yeah.
Do they think about timings? Do they think about stress? Do they think about the demands that they're going through? No, because they're thinking about their task in isolation on their desk. It's understandable, but we need to be able to change that approach and view and make it far more of a kind of collegiate team approach between ship and shore. And I think that's a hugely important part of all of this.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your time today. It's been great
My
speaking to
pleasure.
you. This has been a really insightful, interesting episode. I've learned a lot. And yeah, thank you for, like I said, delivering such a fantastic resource to the industry. I hope that
My
you've
pleasure.
got much more fantastic ideas up your sleeve. But yeah, great talking to you, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Carl, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Stephen.
Cheers.